Yes, since everyone is settled, I think we should start without any delay. So, for our next session, we will be doubling down on our discussion on AI risks through this next fireside chat on navigating the AI risk landscape, separating fact from fiction. We intend to advance discussions on the nature and urgency of AI related risks. For this fireside chat, we'll be joined by Mr. Sameer Kanwar, Director, Digital Health, India and South Asia at PATH. Next up, we'll have Dr. Vijay Arya, who is a senior researcher at IBM Research India. I request the panelists to kindly proceed to the stage. The panel will be joined by Ms. Meghna Bal, director at Esya Center, a New Delhi-based think tank. Next up, we'll have Ms. Shreya Tewari, who is a technology lawyer and policy manager. Lastly, the panel will be moderated by Mr. Sundar Narayanan, a researcher and advisor in AI ethics and governance. Over to you, Sundar.
Hi, everybody. It's brilliant to be there here, and then I hope you all had good dose of coffee. Just be prepared for this particular session. You need to pay a lot of attention. We were just trying to catch up with the panelist for 5 minutes before the session. That's the first time we are all meeting personally, and I don't think it's going to be a easy conversation for you to grasp. So I suggest that have a load of coffee and then be prepared. Okay, today we're going to be discussing about navigating AI risk landscape, separating fact from fiction. I just want to set some context here. So essentially, we've had we are going through 4 different themes of focus that is evolving at this point in time in AI. One is we initially looked at it from a ethical issue, privacy issue, etc., which translated into frameworks, and we heard about panelists speaking about how frameworks are evolving and things like that. And now we are actually looking at a phase of how frameworks are getting translated into regionalization and how they want it to be implemented, right? On the other side, there is a whole gamut of governance, standardization, and regulation, which is evolving parallelly. On the third leg, you also see the whole growth of how technology is growing from LLMs to agentic systems to action models that we are moving towards. And all this amidst geo, business, and political landscape shifts that we are speaking about. So there is going to be a lot of contextual things that we need to look at. We need a baseline for us to see how we can align all of this. And Ankit, when in his address, specifically mentioned about how lack of clarity of regulatory expectations is one of the baselines of that is impeding organizations to effectively implement responsible AI in that sense. Now, we're going to be looking at it from that perspective, right? What is critical in that whole scope? I wanted to pick it up from Abhilash in the last panel, who mentioned about passwords. So privacy, accountability, safety, security, explainability, reliability, and sustainability. If you actually fairness, reliability, and sustainability. If you look at it from this landscape, risk management is seen to be one of the tools to be used for handling all the complexities that we are seeing in the world at this point in time. Now, when we look at risk management, there are some nuances that we need to get into context. One is it is very positive from a perspective of it is a systematic approach, and it can be applied universally with some subjectivities. On the other side, it is also perceived to be, some risks are perceived to be a little overrated, and it is very resource intensive. In this broader context, I want to start off the discussion with this question to the panelists. And just for your consideration, the panel is very diverse. You're going to have each panelist bringing in very different perspective. Mr. Sameer is going to bring in a perspective of digital health, and Meghna is going to be bringing in a perspective of public policy, law, and civil society. Shreya is going to be bringing in a perspective of online safety, and Vijay is going to be looking at it from a perspective of developer and deployer lens, and you will see how they see it from their individual lens, and you'll see the reflections. To start with, Vijay, I want to start with you. There is a lot of developments that are happening at this point in time, specifically on code, utilities, libraries, tools, and solutions. So how do you see AI risk matters in the current world of cults?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Sundar. So I think when we examine, I kind of like to think from first principles perspective. Okay, so when we think of examining risk or understanding risk in something, it's important to kind of trace back a bit on what are the characteristics of AI which is making us think in this manner. So from product or solutions perspective, right? Earlier when we used to develop software, right, we would have programmers who would encode logic or business rules in code, right? And it would be tested in a certain manner. Now, when we saw the emergence of these supervised machine learning models, it was a paradigm shift, right? So those rules which are encoded programmers, they are no longer actually explicitly encoded. The model is going to learn them automatically using a large amount of data. And that is a paradigm shift, right? So for example, the software is not working, etc. You can't go and go inside a model and say, okay, here is a statement because of which the model performed in an unexpected manner, right? So that is a paradigm shift. So that is a characteristic that is which is causing us to discuss about AI risk, etc. Now another paradigm shift was when we had these large language models that came in, right? So one important ability that came in from this change was you're able to talk to the model, able to converse to the model. You can ask the model what is the capital of a certain country, and it'll give you the answer. Or you can instruct the model to write a poem, it'll write it. You can instruct the model to write code, it'll generate code for you, and so on. So that is a paradigm shift, right? Now, of course, there's a risk then, sometimes the model dreams up, it hallucinates and so on. It generates code which is not right, etc. And that was one paradigm shift. And then there was another paradigm shift which we were talking about earlier is, when you go from large language models to, being like, they're getting better and better. They were like, treated as stochastic parrots a couple of, 1 or 2 years back, etc. But as they're kind of improving, people are kind of mixing these tools along with language models and building these agentic workflows. So here again, you have another paradigm shift where you can have an agent that acts on your behalf. You can say, okay, give me an agent that, goes and searches the web for you on something. Create an agent that, fixes the PR issue on GitHub, right? Or, create an agent that, goes and does online shopping for you on your behalf. Now, this adds another level of complexity, right? So when we see these characteristics, it becomes evident that we are dealing with something that's kind of slightly imperfect, right? Which has a lot of capabilities, and that is why we need to kind of discuss about all the risks associated with these technologies.
Yeah. That's brilliant, Vijay. Sameer, I just want to come to you with this. Now, Vijay is speaking about where things are evolving and it is imperfect. But when you're trying to apply something that is evolving and imperfect in digital health environment, it has its own complexities and it has its own reflections. I just want you to reflect about it from the lens of code utilities or tools or solutions that's getting used at this point in time.
Thanks so much. I think I'll just pick up from where Vijay left in terms of, I think what he was talking about was the uncertainty about using the technology, right? And that's the space which we are dealing in terms, AI has become a black box for us, right? We really don't know. The person who's actually writing the LLM and then the person who's using it as an agent or as a tool really doesn't know how it's going to respond, right? And that's where the issue of trust is coming up, and we talked about it initially, during the day that, there's a trust issue which comes around technology. And I think there's a lack of ownership which has started coming up as to who's responsible if, let's say, a model which I have trained is not functioning the way it is supposed to function. Do I go back to the LLM and tell them, boss, you are the one who's wrong? Or is it the tool and the code which I have used on it, or the data sets which I have used for training my model is going to be is the problem, right? So I think we need to clear out this uncertainty in the space which we have created, right? And we blurred those physical lines, what he was talking about, there used to be a front-end coder and there used to be a developer, right? And somebody was doing the Python or somebody was doing the Java, right? So all those lines are just blurred out. And when now we look at the applicability of this in the health sector, it is extremely complex. And I'll go back to where Sohail was saying that, why sectorial risks need to be defined separately when we are dealing with it, because each sector will have its own contextualizations of stuff. And just picking also from Ayushi's presentation, right, what she said. So we are now moving in the healthcare space, or probably we've already there, in where we are looking at self-screening, self-diagnostics, triaging and self-treatment. Do we want to be there? Right? We are already sitting on the verge of it, right? And do we really want to move into that space? Is it safe? Or is there a huge risk to the humanity in the way we are using and wanting to use technology? And I'll also close with a point. Is this entire space based on needs assessment? Or is it just because I have the technology and I want to push the technology and there's a business model which is being driven that this technology is landing at our door, right? And just look at the global market. We are looking at a 1 trillion market for only AI, right? Out of which almost like they are saying about 200 billion of 300 billion is going to be in the health sector, right? Out of which the focus is diagnostics. 40% of that investment is going into diagnostics. Now, from the health perspective, has anybody asked the health industry whether you want diagnostics or you want something else? Nobody has asked the industry at all, right? The technologists have decided, the funder has decided that, oh, here's the scope, and I'm going to push it. So there has been no need assessment from the sector perspective that, oh, I need technology. Yes, I need technology and I need it for this. So there's a lack of trust. There's a lack of relationship between the sector for which the technology is being developed. And there is a huge amount of uncertainty on the output which is coming out of that model, right? So all these factors need to come together if we are really using at an impact at the scale and at the level at which we are looking at.
That's really brilliant. And that takes me to you, Meghna. When we are actually speaking about, and Sameer pointed it out very clearly, that we are speaking about uncertainty, we are speaking about extended use where we are saying everything will be self in that sense. And the third point in terms of are we building the products because it has a need or it's because the technology is available, right? This actually brings in a lot of legal complications in terms of how the society deals with it, how government deals with it, and how civil society looks at it, right? So would you want to reflect on that from your end?
Yeah, I think when you're thinking about AI risks, okay, I'll move a little back and I'll talk about ethics, because ethics tend to be the frame through which we think about risks and risk mitigation and risk management. I think it's a bad way to think about it because, one, ethics are subjective. So what's right to you is not right, may not necessarily be right to me.
That's so wonderful because I'm an ethicist.
Yeah, I know. And we've seen it play out as well, right? In real time with Elon Musk's image generation tool. He is a self-styled free speech absolutist, and his image generation tool is producing pretty heinous images, including Hitler imagery, Disney cartoons murdering each other, etc., which other large platforms don't allow you to do. And it's because of this moral subjectivity that this is allowed to translate. Next, it is really hard to design, to kind of translate ethics into code. It's extremely resource intensive. So how do you expect small companies that are probably finding it hard to just, source engineers to build their product or work on their product, to then get into this concept of translating ethics into product design? And even large companies struggle with it, right? We saw what happened with Gemini and the kind of generation of the US founding fathers as African Americans. And then lastly, it is not conducive to good rule or lawmaking, and the EU AI Act is a perfect example of that, because it leads to a situation where there is neither granularity nor proportionality. And one example of the lack of proportionality of the EU AI Act, which basically tries to translate these ethical principles into law, is that a vehicle or credit scoring systems without AI, vehicle is just supposed to be safe and credit scoring systems are supposed to be transparent. But if you look at the EU AI Act, just because AI is involved, it requires both to be safe and transparent. So again, I mean, there's just a lack, and that creates implications for innovation, etc. I think when you're thinking about AI systems, one, you can't be thinking about AI as a monolith, and that is something that, I mean, it lends itself to kind of verbal economy. It's much easier to say AI than to talk about this model or this system, etc., etc. But to your point of contextualization, it has to be highly contextualized to models, to situations, to sectors, etc., and all of these factors matter. And I think we need to talk about it in that context. And two, I think from the standpoint of harms, I mean, we need to think about it from a harms first perspective, not from an ethics first perspective, though I think those conversations are useful in creating awareness about risks. But I think you need to think about it from a harms first perspective. And there you have to categorize the harm, so you have to understand whether a public or a private right is being violated. You need to understand whether it is a novel harm or is it just a new technological means of carrying out a certain harm. So in the context of deepfakes, I think that this is where it kind of arises, where deepfakes are just a new way of producing misinformation. But there has been so much hype about the potential disaster that they could spell for misinformation, for trust in our societies, without really assessing the effect of other kinds of misinformation on trust in society. And if you look at empirical studies on that, it finds that basically deepfakes are not more convincing than traditional misinformation or disinformation. So I think we need to think about these things more deeply and also contextualize them within the kind of lineage of technology and not just look at AI as something separate from them.
That's very useful. Shreya, I'm just going to come to you with this particular point where if in an environment where we need to be more harm focused when it affects civil society at large, and we are actually speaking about moral subjectivities involved in the use of technology and how the technology is consumed by humans at this point in time. How do you see it from an online safety lens, and how you reflect the risk considerations from that point of view?
I'm going to pick up from what Meghna said about the legacy of harms translating from offline to online to then every form of technology that then translates to online. On the topic of cults and how risks are associated with that, I think, as with any foundation, the foundation on which AI will, even well-intentioned AI will play out, will have any risks within cult, will have the ripple effects across all ways in which it translates. So again, as with any other foundation, there needs to be safety, reliability, all of that put at the front and center of that. An example of this, again, leaning into online safety, as you said, is imagine there's a chatbot interacting with a child on lessons or education. If the foundations of what data set that chatbot was trained on are not correct, how would they answer questions? For example, debatable questions such as, oh, I went to school and I'm a girl, but everyone says I'm a boy. I don't know what to do. These are very tough questions that, if not for the right framework on which these data sets are trained and then built, will cause confusion in the mind of all users, especially more vulnerable ones in society. So from an online safety perspective, I think leaning into audit, constant monitoring and evaluation of those data sets is important.
That's very interesting that you mentioned about vulnerable environments. So I just want to highlight that this was a debate that came in the previous session in terms of UNESCO's principles and things like that. That's the only set of principles. I would urge you to go and look at other set of principles that are available. That's the only set of principles which not only speaks about vulnerable populations, but also speaks about people in vulnerable circumstances. Most of us are in many vulnerable circumstances when it comes to technology. Not necessarily we will be classified as vulnerable population. I just wanted to give that distinction when you actually mentioned it. It's very important to consider. From the point of view where you said audits or having validation mechanisms is very important. I know each of you come from a very different kind of lenses. So Sameer, I would like to start with you to see how do you think organizations need to deal with it, and what are the top risks that they need to look at, and how do you think they need to deal with that risks when they're looking at either reliability, safety, or even audit of AI systems, as the case may be?
So I think to me that will be sector based, like and what we discussed before, right?
Yeah, essentially from your sectoral point of view.
Yeah. So I think health is extremely sensitive, and therefore it needs to have a lot of context coming in from the perspective of in terms of when the product is being developed, right? And I think the huge gap, if I look at the sectorial gaps, I think health has the largest gap in terms of human resource in the technology being understood by the sector. And if you look at the entire profile, of sectors, you would unfortunately find health being at the last sector to actually adopt technology. Specifically, where probably the sector which has the maximum use of it, unfortunately, and that's largely been because of a disconnect between the end user of that technology, right, and the person who's actually making the technology. And the second is that there is no demand for healthcare. There was no demand for healthcare, at least in the low and middle income countries, till the time COVID hit us, actually. And probably that also has died down over a period of time. We really don't want to bother about it. Neither do countries want to bother about it in terms of a sector, right? If you look at the investments which get into the health sector, are bare minimal, right? In terms of, let's say, look at India, we invest about 2%, 2.5% into the health sector. That's about all. Though being highest on the SDG goals, right? So the kind of investment which is required, where we have the industry and the government coming, because public health is again like public education is a subject where the government has a huge stake, right? So you have the government at one end, you have the end user in terms of doctors at the other end, and you have the citizen at the third end, right? And of course you have the industry which is actually trying to push in technology, right, without understanding as to what the need on ground is of that technology, right? So unless and until these four players come together and sit in a room and decide, oh, this is my need, this is where I need technology in the public health space, this is where we think niche technology is required to overcome, let's say, a human resource barrier which we have in this sector, huge one, which can actually be addressed by technology, right? Unfortunately, not being addressed. The government decides, okay, these are my priorities and this is where I am ready to invest, right? We will keep going around in this sector where the technologist will keep driving the technology down based on his assessment or her assessment as a product of technology, because somebody is funding them, right? So the money is available, right? If I am a innovator, right? If somebody says, okay, I'm going to give you a $2 million and I want something to be done on vector-borne diseases, I'll be more than happy to jump in and start doing my research and start working, right? Without even going back and looking at the need of the sector, right? I think that's the huge gap in the health sector which I see, probably, which might be different as compared to any other sector.
That's very interesting. This actually brings me to Meghna, to specifically look at it here. When we are, I just want to zoom back and then look at it from a multiple industry perspective, right? So now Sameer is speaking about healthcare and as an industry where different stakeholders need to come together for them to determine how the technology can add value and how it can enhance, right? And there brings in multiple legal complications in that. One, from a perspective of how do we integrate stakeholders together while deciding a legal process for organizing risk management in general. Then the second point is also who's going to be at the table, the representativeness associated with bringing people together from different stakeholder groups, right? So would you want to reflect on that and also provide your lens of how do you see it from a civil society and public policy lens?
Yeah, I think that's a good point you raised, because typically bringing multiple stakeholders who are, I'm assuming, competitors to the table to agree on something like this as to what course of action, what course to take forward is, I would say, naive, because they all compete with each other. They're not really going to say, hey, this is good for us, let's all do it together, or let's all work on this.
That can become a cartel also.
I mean, yeah, it can become a cartel, unlikely to. It's more likely to be just a cagey conversation that, oh no, I think it's all good and let's all just agree to kind of go our separate ways. So that is one thing, considering the incentives of the stakeholders that you are bringing. Typically what happens is, typically a public consultation is the best way to kind of bring in different inputs. The problem is, at least in India, the way consultations have flowed recently is that they tend to be closed door. They tend to be mostly prominent stakeholders that are brought to this and limited voices. And then the more public consultation is just, an exercise just to show that you've done this in a transparent way. But it's really the closed door consultations where, things are decided. And I think thinking more broadly about how frameworks have been devised, whether it's AI or whether it's any other subject related to tech, it tends to be very big tech focused. And it's because we have this kind of obsession with large technology companies, and we think they're all that's wrong with the technology world. But really, if you look at it, they are kind of, they are working harder than most of them are to kind of mitigate the harms that are prevalent within their products. Two, you also have to think about the kind of downside of being too prescriptive with rules, because if you are too prescriptive, then you basically relegate trust and safety to becoming a compliance function. So you create a disincentive to innovate in risk mitigation, because the companies are like, you've laid out what we have to do, so we're just going to now make it compliance. We're just going to comply with what you have said, and we're not really going to focus on anything else. And the Digital Services Act is a perfect example of that, right? When that came, then a bunch of companies started firing their trust and safety teams because they're like, hey, we don't have to really innovate on this anymore. It's just a compliance function for us. So I think we need to think about all these things. Obviously, rules are going to come from government, but I think we need to think about the balance between how prescriptive we have to be. Of course, it has to be contextual, whether it be sectoral, and even within sectoral, like if we take health, there's a difference between surgery, there's a difference between diagnostics. And I think one last thing I want to raise, because we have been speaking about health, is that, when we talk about the autonomy risk of AI, we talk about it from the context of AI robbing our autonomy. But what we don't consider is that, you read any document, that's what it is about. Even in the EU AI Act, they gave this example of, basically a Pavlovian kind of use of AI where it rings and forces people to basically work beyond, what is a safe hour. Not to mention the fact that that can be done with regular technology, not just AI. But anyway, moving away from that, I think what we need to think more carefully about, what I think is the autonomy risk with AI, and the autonomy risk with maybe all technology, is that the abdication of technology. The more a technology can think of itself, the more prone I think human beings are to abdicating our own kind of decision making. And you've seen it in adverse incidents that involving AI, right? So Tesla's self-driving function, the guy who got into a crash and died, essentially got into the car and started playing a video game and didn't pay attention when the sensors gave warnings, etc. So I think from that perspective, we need to kind of, again, think about these things counterintuitively and not get into orthodoxies of thought, which is what happens, particularly with the EU, or particularly with any kind of framework that's brought out by a government, because it becomes political, they don't want to roll back, and then it becomes a kind of thought or orthodoxy. And I think we need to keep trying to innovate and thinking about these things from different perspectives.
Okay, that's very interesting. There are 2 points that comes out of it, and Vijay, I want to come to you about that. The first point is that there is a general sense that a lot of efforts and policies are more focused on what is there, both for and against the big tech focused environments, so to say, and the startups have a very different environment relative to it, and it has its own complications in that sense, right? That's one part that I wanted to bounce off and then take your inputs on. And Shreya, I wanted to ask you more about the second part of the point that Meghna mentioned about, where it comes to when we are dealing with automation bias. It's a very complicated scenario. It's not easy to handle, and specifically when you're looking at it from an online safety perspective and moral subjectivity that we spoke about a little earlier, there's going to be a lot of complications to look at. I want both of you to reflect on those thoughts. It will be interesting to hear.
So I think so when we design solutions, etc., right? I think some of the discussions were focused on like, okay, that trust may not be very important, and they could be, it could be overlooked, etc., and so on, right? I think I disagree a little bit on that point of view, because most, as Meghna was also mentioning, when we design a product, we want people to use it, right? And the way they're going to use it is when they're going to trust the model, they're going to trust the system, they're going to trust the AI system, and so on. So trust is at the very center when we try to design products, or try to design solutions, because we want people to use it, right? So that's very important. Now, in terms of technology, large companies and startups, etc., figuring out how they're going to enable trust, what is going to be the right strategy, and so on. I think there's already a lot of work in AI on establishing the right governance structure. So, for instance, let's say if I'm training a large language model, it's good to have another team that verifies the copyright or the licensing of a data set, and only when they approve it, that's when we're going to actually use the data to train the model, right? And for instance, like people have, even we have proposed things like model fact sheets. Just like nutrition labels for models, you can have model fact sheets. They actually tell you exactly what the model does, where it performs well, where it does not perform well, what's the explainability capability of the model? Is the model going to be biased in certain scenarios, and so on? So, and things like maintaining provenance and audit, etc., right? So all these aspects have been researched quite a lot, and a lot of organizations are putting together the governance structure, and that kind of is a win-win situation for the organization as well, because when they're going to sort of launch a product, for example, if I'm going to launch a product in, let's say, in the medical domain, right? If the doctor does not trust my model, there's a huge problem. If I can't make the model explainable, the doctor might not trust it, and that's a problem. So trust is at the very center of designing good products, and the governance framework, or even, for example, things like, let's say, when you use large language models, they hallucinate, right? So people are designing HAP filters, and hallucination detectors as guardrails that are going to put to kind of use on top of these large language models, or solutions that are going to be built on top of it. So I think all of these aspects are kind of being worked out, and there's already a lot of information, a lot of know-how among the different tech companies and different startups. And I think Nasscom and a lot of other organizations have put together a huge number of framework that the organization can follow. You could you have maturity models that organizations can see how mature is their risk assessment framework. Are they actually what is the current point of view on whether the the system is less risky, more risky, and so on, right? So I think these things are coming out quite strongly, and I think the startups can definitely use a lot of the information, a lot of the know-how which is already there in the community. Yeah.
Shreya, you want to add your point?
Yes, a few things. Very interesting what Vijay said. So I see it in two ways. There's existing platforms that have inadvertently, by the benefit of starting early, become larger with larger user base, and then there are new ones that are starting. As we saw with Zoom post-COVID, during COVID, they didn't have privacy at the center of their design, and that then they had to reverse engineer it. I think with AI, if it is not by design in the beginning life cycle stages of product development, it will inadvertently cause impacts in the later stages. But at the same time, with big tech or other service providers with larger user base, I think it is a object of regulation that they will have to reverse engineer that into their product mechanisms. I have worked with tech platforms to engage with government, and then with government to engage with tech platforms. And the one thing I've learned is that they will push back on anything that affects their bottom line. And so I think coming to it from a pragmatic point of view, thinking of a minimum viable solution that makes all stakeholders feel like they're sort of happy but not too happy might be a good way to go about it. But I definitely don't think that there's benefit operating in silos, especially when representation matters so much. And this generation in the coming few will build sort of the training sets that will impact a lot of how the end user interacts with the AI. Coming to the question of bias that you mentioned in automation, it's a matter, in my opinion, it's a matter of mitigating it rather than removing it, because I think Ayushi spoke about how she's done research on how there will always be hallucinations in AI. But to the point of mitigation, thinking through evidence, thinking through studying what current gaps look like is a solid ground for starting up, rather than, as you said, thinking of trying to solve problems that don't exist. The other thing that I think that human intervention will always be required for is context. During the pandemic, for example, during any pandemic that the world sees, or during time of national emergencies or global emergencies, it becomes important to then manage the scale through both AI and human intervention. But I don't ever think that first principle thinking, like you need to know what to ask in AI for then AI to be able to answer it. And I think that point of intervention will always be done by humans. And to that extent, I think in the introduction of the introduction of human interventions and automation biases will always be important.
That's interesting reflection. I just wanted to quickly, time is up. It's so surprising that 14 minutes became 2 minutes just in a matter of seconds. So, so let's probably let's probably quickly wrap it up with this last point. I just want it more like a quick comment from each of you on at this point in time, for governments to look at it from a lens of regulation or policy on or guiding AI risk management or AI risk related approaches. What are the 2 points that each of you will think about or reflect on?
So I think one important point is to sort of support innovation in responsible manner, right? The policy or regulation or any kind of enforcement should encourage innovation to be responsible and not just kill innovation. So that's very high. That's a very high level. Another sort of I'll just give you a simple example of something that's on large language models is one kind of conflict with this with people training open source models is when they want to put out a model, there's always a risk. What if someone misuses the model and so on. So one novel idea that was proposed was to kind of have a license, a behavioral use case license for a large language model, right? And the government can come here, just like you have regulations for you enforce patents, you enforce open source licenses. You could also enforce responsible AI licenses on large language models. So that could be a good combination, where people want to innovate more, they want to put out their models. At the same time, government supports in making sure that when the clause is put in, it could be enforced through legal framework. So that's one example.
Meghna?
Yeah, so to that point I was making earlier, I think that if you make rules from the perspective or vantage point of large companies, you tend to leave out the smaller guys who don't have the resources to be carrying out all the functions that the latter are, the former are. Risk audits, etc. All of it is extremely resource intensive, and having that number of people adds a huge compliance cost, and it kind of shuts out small companies. So I think thinking about it from that perspective, from a proportionality of entity size perspective. And then the other one is something that we haven't really spoken about, is the risk of government use of AI systems and the need for transparency around that. The general risk of government using technology, particularly in this country, is that it tends to be an excuse for a kind of recession of the government from the ground. So if a technological solution is deployed, there's a presumption that it's going to fulfill the governance role, which it doesn't. And I feel like with AI, that risk kind of amplifies a little bit because there is a kind of autonomous, self-executing feature to it. So I think one, there needs to be transparency around what the government is doing with AI, what it's deploying it for, and two, as we've seen in the US, that if there are any guardrails that have to be put, they have to first be put for the government's use of AI technologies, and then we can think about other
So you're speaking
sectors.
about public impact, not necessarily government alone, right? It's a broader.
Well, I'm talking more about like public sector use.
Public sector use. Yeah,
public
perfect.
sector use.
I just wanted to clarify that.
Public sector use.
Shreya.
I would think that representation to begin with, to identify the end user of a product you're creating and to then check with them whether the solution you're providing is catered to them. Specific to the government, I think public-private partnerships is a useful way, not just horizontally but vertically, to go deep into the grassroots to identify what kind of access the private sector is looking for the public to support, keeping again user safety at the center of it. I think one other thing that I mentioned earlier when we were talking was the need for upskilling, and that being pushed by the government, that the technology space is moving very fast, and the things that matter today and the things that will matter even maybe 3 months from now will become very new and very much more gravitated. So I think keeping room for regular learnings and regular knowledge sharing by the government, through the government, of the government also, will be very useful going forward.
Sameer.
I think the first is, and there's probably not an answer, but we need to look for an answer, is in terms of how do we stop policy following technology, right? And how do we ensure that the technological developments are equally, balanced between the policy and an evolving environment, right? So how does government enable a system where the policy is able to quickly evolve as the technology is evolving, right? Because, I mean, unless and until these two things move in hand, it's not going to be effective. That's one. Second is equal amount of investment. When we look at innovations and technologies, we keep looking at the private sector, because that's probably we feel where the money is. I think it's the other way around. We need to look at as to whether the government is ready to invest or not. For example, let's say the India AI mission, or let's say the Center of Excellences of AI coming up in India. That's the right model, right? So the government is throwing in its quote saying that, okay, we are ready to invest because we know the public impact of it. I think the third place where we need to look at is also from a bottom to top approach in terms of policy, because when we look at overarching AI policies, which is cross-sectorial, right, it becomes hugely complex, right? Can we look at an approach from the government perspective that, let's look at a specific sector where we think it's a low-hanging fruit, we can come up with policies, and that helps us in building across other sectors, and then look at an overarching policy. I'm just throwing these points. They may not be solutions actually, but that's probably open thinking.
That's brilliant, Sameer. So AI risk conversations are complicated. They're not going to be so easy to conclude, summarize, and analyze in a matter of 35 minutes. What's very important as a takeaway that I wanted to leave for the audience here is that AI risk will also go through an evolution of AMC, which is align, manage, cooperate. You will end up having some kind of alignment, either sectoral, regional, or vulnerable people kind of alignment. You will need to have mechanisms and measures to manage them, and you will need to find out ways how AI risk management is going to cooperate with or coexist with regulatory environment and compliance requirements, so that it can have a balanced view and then bring in a meaningful sense for organizations. I'm extremely discouraged to open it up for audience questions at this point in time, because it's 6 minutes up since the time is up. So we are going to be around, some of us are going to be around. So feel free to have a chat with us or bounce off your thoughts and questions. I really appreciate your patient listening. Thank you, and over to you.
A big round of applause for our panelists and the moderator. Unfortunately, we don't have any time for questions, but I request Ankit to felicitate the speakers with our token of appreciation. We hope that these conversations will be carried forwarded over at lunch as well.